The civil rights movement transformed American law and culture, but it did not resolve the contradictions it exposed. Many of the systems activists fought, economic inequality, voter suppression, racialized policing, adapted rather than disappeared. By framing the movement as a completed chapter, society avoided confronting its unfinished work. The secret history lies not only in the past, but in how that past is remembered. Simplified narratives offer comfort, but they also obscure responsibility. The movement was not a miracle, it was a warning. It showed that rights are not permanent, that progress requires constant pressure, and that justice is never granted without struggle. Those who organized quietly, argued fiercely, and endured repression understood this truth. Desegregation were inseparable from demands for fair wages, job access, and economic dignity. When activists challenged economic inequality, they threatened powerful interests that extended far beyond the South. This is why some campaigns stalled or were quietly redirected. Economic justice was seen as too disruptive, too close to socialism, too dangerous during the Cold War. By sidelining these demands, the movement achieved legal victories while leaving deeper structural inequalities intact. The forgotten history of these struggles reminds us that civil rights were never just about access. They were about power. Women were the backbone of the civil rights movement, yet their contributions remain among its most underrepresented stories. They organized boycotts, raised funds, provided shelter, and maintained communication networks that kept campaigns alive during setbacks. Many were excluded from leadership roles, despite doing the majority of the work, reflecting broader gender hierarchies within both Black communities and activist organizations. At the same time, the movement was deeply connected to labor struggles, a link often downplayed to make civil rights appear less radical. Demands for voting rights and repression also exposed contradictions within American democracy that activists skillfully exploited. Images of peaceful protesters met with brutality forced the federal government to confront the gap between its ideals and its actions. Change came not because the system willingly reformed itself, but because the cost of maintaining injustice became too visible to ignore. The movement succeeded in part by surviving this hidden war, adapting to an environment where every step forward was watched, recorded, and resisted. One of the most uncomfortable truths about the civil rights movement is that it unfolded under constant surveillance from the very government later celebrated for passing civil rights legislation. Federal agencies monitored leaders, infiltrated organizations, and collected vast amounts of information under the justification of national security. Activists were labeled threats, not citizens demanding rights. Phones were tapped, mail was intercepted, and informants were planted in meetings meant to build trust. This pressure shaped decisions in ways rarely discussed, forcing organizers to balance visibility with safety. At the same time, local law enforcement often collaborated with segregationist groups, turning violence into an unofficial tool of policy. Arrests, fabricated charges, and strategic harassment drained resources and morale. Yet, remain nonviolent, even when violence was guaranteed in return. Should activists negotiate with politicians who had broken promises before? Should federal intervention be welcomed or feared as another form of control? These questions divided organizations and friendships, and sometimes led to public fractures that the media portrayed as chaos rather than debate. What is rarely acknowledged is that this internal conflict sharpened the movement's strategy. By arguing, failing, and adapting, activists learned how to apply pressure where it mattered most. The public face of unity masked a private reality of constant reassessment, where progress depended on disagreement as much as solidarity. While history often centers on charismatic leaders, the civil rights movement was never driven by a single voice or vision. Behind every iconic speech stood a network of organizers who debated tactics, questioned authority, and sometimes clashed bitterly over direction. Figures like Martin Luther King Jr. became symbols, but symbols are often simplified, stripped of nuance, and separated from the people who challenged them from within. Younger activists, particularly those involved in student-led organizations, frequently criticized established leaders for moving too slowly or compromising too easily. These tensions were not signs of weakness. They were evidence of a living movement wrestling with impossible choices. Should protests, intimidation, and economic punishment designed to crush dissent before it reached national attention? What made the movement secret was not just what was hidden from the public, but what was deliberately erased. The internal debates, the failures, the compromises, and the sheer amount of grassroots labor required to make visible change possible. The famous moments that defined the era were only the surface of a much deeper struggle that unfolded in kitchens, basements, and back rooms across the South. Understanding this hidden foundation is essential, because it reveals that the movement's success was never inevitable. It was the result of relentless pressure applied over decades by people who knew they might never see victory themselves. The civil rights movement is often remembered as a clean moral arc, led by a few heroic figures and resolved through landmark laws. But beneath that familiar narrative lies a far more complex and contested history. Long before televised marches and famous speeches, the movement existed as a patchwork of local struggles driven by ordinary people whose names never entered textbooks. Sharecroppers, domestic workers, churchwomen, veterans, and students organized quietly in hostile environments where speaking out could cost them their jobs, their homes, or their lives. These early efforts were rarely spontaneous. They were methodical, patient, and deeply strategic. Black communities built parallel institutions, churches, mutual aid networks, and informal schools to sustain resistance when public protest was impossible. At the same time, white supremacist power structures were not passive obstacles, but active systems of surveillance.